All right, good afternoon, everybody. Steve Kornacki here at the big board. We have been counting down to the midterm elections for weeks now, for months now. And look at this, the clock. We are so close now that the seconds are ticking down on this thing. What you got here, this is the countdown to Election Day, tomorrow being Election Day. So 11 hours, 57 minutes, 46 seconds from now, it will actually be Election Day. And it will not just be Election Day, I should say, but there will actually be votes that are cast. 11 hours, 57 minutes, and 36 seconds now, because remember, the tiny little hamlet of Dixville Notch, New Hampshire, they cast their ballots at midnight, so about a dozen people are going to go in there. They each have their own voting booth up there. It's that old Grand Hotel, the Balsams. I think they're renovating it now. They all cast their ballots. That's the law in New Hampshire. If you get 100% turnout in a precinct, you can close down the precinct, you can count up the ballots, and you can announce the results. So with only 12 people, you know, the pressure's on. It's a big community event. You better be at your ballot box at midnight. They announced it. There's television cameras there and all of that. So that's midnight. It'll be a little bit later tomorrow when the heavy voting, though, starts coming in. So, again, welcome. We've been doing this every day in the run-up to the midterms. Consider this our pregame show. We call it 218. I don't think I need to explain to you 218. That is the magic number that each party needs to get House control. We have been asking the question, are Democrats going to end their 8 years in the wilderness when it comes to the House and win back that majority? Are Republicans going to find some way to hold them off, to keep that blue wave from hitting them? Also talking a little bit about the Senate side. Is there a chance Democrats could still find that narrow path to Senate control? Or on the flip side, do Republicans expand their majority in the Senate? Certainly the president seems to be thinking along those lines. He's been talking more about the Senate lately than the House. As always, we're going to be joined by some of the smartest minds we know in a few minutes who have been looking at all the numbers, all of the trends, all of the maps. Going to break things down with them. But first, as always, let's start right here at the board and give you sort of the final readout that we're getting. You know, a lot of polls out there have been coming in the last few days. Feels like the question we've been asking, the big picture question we've been asking over the last week in this is there going to be some kind of a late break that goes one way? Is there going to be a late break of a couple points in the Democrats' favor, a late break of a couple points in the Republicans' favor? Something that you see not just in an individual race, but something that's a broader trend, more of a national trend. Because the idea, you know, we've been saying you can paint that scenario where if everything breaks the Republicans' way, they hold on to the House by a couple seats. And you can paint that scenario where if the Democrats are getting all the breaks, it's not just a majority for Democrats, but you're talking like a 40 or 50 seat gain for them. And the difference between those two outcomes, it may not actually be that big when it comes to what kind of a swing you need. So the question's been, is there going to be some kind of uniform national swing in the final days? With that in mind, let's take you through some of the polling we've been getting. One of the best things about this election, we've been talking about it a lot, is the New York Times. New York Times, the Upshot, that's their data operation there. They've been polling all of these House races around the country. They've been extremely transparent about the process. So they reported out sort of their final batch of numbers. Well, I was going to go through those. I forgot. We got Trump's approval rating, too. We should tell you Trump's average approval rating, if you look at all the polls that are out there right now, clocks in at 43.6%. You know, frankly, when you compare it to where it's been in his presidency, that's on the higher end. If you talk to Republicans this year, they probably wanted it a little higher than that, but I think they feared it would be lower than that going into Election Day. Also, there is the generic ballot. You average those together, a 7.3-point lead there on average for Democrats. Again, that's in line with what Democrats have been saying they need in that generic ballot to get control of the House. Now, I think we can go through. Here we go. Let's go through some of those final House race polls we have. See if you feel there's any kind of a trend here. I'm a little interested in this. The 6th District of Georgia, remember that massively expensive special election where the Democrats pumped in $30 million last year, fell short with John Ossoff. They have a new candidate here, Lucy McBath. Final poll has McBath running ahead of Karen Handel, who won that special election. Remember, this is a district here. This is just north of Atlanta, typically a Republican district in the past, a wealthy suburban district. Did not like Trump. Trump won the district, but only by a point after Romney had won it by 23 points a couple years before that. Handel, she seems to be in some trouble here in this district. How about Texas's 32nd district? This is a wealthy suburban district. You are talking about Pete Sessions. This is a former chairman of the NRCC, used to be the strategist for the Republicans nationally. Look at the trouble he's got himself into here. Again, this is one of those districts. It's Republican held. It's suburban, and it voted for Hillary Clinton in 2016. Again, voters who do not like Donald Trump. They already didn't like Donald Trump, and now are they taking it out on Pete Sessions here? That poll troubling for Republicans. A little bit of a different story in Illinois' 14th district. Donald Trump did carry this district. Mitt Romney did carry this district 4 years before him, not by huge margins, but this is a little different territory, more ex-urban here. But Randy Holtgren was thought to be in better shape than this. Now, it's one poll. Maybe you could always have, an outlier. You could always have something that's not quite right in a poll. But this, on the eve of the election, may be one of the most encouraging individual polling developments for Democrats to see their candidate 6 points ahead of Holtgren in this district that was, of course, as I say, a Trump district, Michigan's 8th district. Again, another very encouraging piece of news here for Democrats. Mike Bishop, Republican incumbent. Republicans were concerned all year about how seriously he was taking the race when it came to raising money there. Their super PAC didn't seem too interested in bailing him out. They felt if he wasn't going to support himself. But look, again, this is a Trump district. Trump did win this district, but the Democrat Alyssa Slotkin leading by 7 in this final poll. We'll give you one more here. New York's 19th, the Hudson Valley. This is one of those, classic, they call it a pivot district, right? It went from Obama to Trump. Obama won this thing by about 6. Trump won this by about 6. And now the Democrat in the final poll, again, they finished this up, I think, last night. Antonio Delgado a point ahead of John Faso, the Republican there. So that's that is the final batch of polling we're getting. We've seen, some Senate polls out today. I saw one in New Jersey that had Bob Menendez going ahead by 15 points. We've been thinking Menendez might survive in New Jersey, but again, has there been a late shift that you see in New Jersey, some of these other places? At the last minute, is this moving a little bit in the Democrats' direction? I think that's a question I'm interested in asking our guests about. We say we bring some of the smartest people we know. We got 2 of them today. Here we go, right there. You've got Margie Omero on your left. She is the Democratic pollster partner at GBA Strategies and a co-host of the podcast The Pollsters. And Henry Olsen, senior fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center and editor of Flyover Country at unheard.com. Thanks to both of you for being with us. And Henry, let me start with you, actually, because you just put up at National Review your forecast for the election. You are not too optimistic when it comes to the Republicans' chances. I think your estimate here is that the Democrats will get a 32-seat gain. Interesting, though, your headline on this. Tomorrow, the Rhinos will take their revenge. Rhinos, the Republicans in name only. Who are the Rhinos, and what does it mean to you in the context of this election?
Yeah, well, the Rhinos are the people who tend to be moderate to liberal on a lot of issues, and particularly the issues that Donald Trump's been talking about a lot, the Muslim ban, immigration, and so forth. And they are the ones who went all the way over to vote for Hillary Clinton, not just vote for Evan McMullin or Gary Johnson. And they've been angry at the president and the Republican Party for 2 years. They're the people who are in those seats that you were talking about, the northern suburbs of Dallas, the high-income areas of Atlanta. And they've been run out of their party, and they're now going to take their revenge on the Republicans. And that's the biggest reason that the Democrats are going to win back the House tomorrow.
Well, so, Margie, what do you think of that? An alliance there between sort of traditionally Republican suburbanites and the Democratic resistance. Is that what you sense the combination is here?
Well, I mean, you see a lot of Democratic candidates across the country talking about issues that unite us, things like health care, which is universal, actually, and other issues that maybe were considered progressive in a different time, but actually have pretty widespread support, like stronger gun laws. While you have folks on the right using the Ed Gillespie strategy, which is not an inclusive big tent strategy, and so it's not a surprise that you see a lot of races, really, breaking a little bit to the left. We'll see, obviously, what happens when people, when all the counting is done. And on top of that, you also have, and this is really important, incredibly strong candidate fields on the Democratic side. You have really, really great candidates and such a diverse candidate. Every single race that you just talked about, Steve, the Democratic candidate was a woman and or a person of color. I mean, there's a real incredible diversity on the Democratic side that I think highlights sort of the future-leaning posture and theme of the Democratic side than what's being offered from the right.
Well, let me ask you, I mean, so if Henry's saying he thinks about a 32-seat gain for Republicans, for Democrats, Margie, would you go on the higher end of that or the lower end? Where are your expectations right now?
I think, look, I want to see Democrats win, and not just in the House, in races around the country, a lot of legislative races. I think that's that's certainly a pick that is in line with a lot of other picks I've seen, a lot of other forecasts I've seen. I don't know if we're going to be further surprised. I mean, if you look at the early voting, you'll see a big surge in early voting in a lot of states, massive surge, and a really big surge in young people. Whether that actually means a surge in Democratic voting overall, we don't know yet. Are those voters that are moving early that would have voted on Election Day, or are they brand new voters? We won't know until all the counting is done. But it is a sign that we may be surprised by the turnout model, perhaps a little bit more than we all anticipated heading the election, but we won't know until late tomorrow night.
Henry, if your intuition is right here, and one of the main stories tomorrow is Suburban Nights, and a lot of these places who weren't nuts about Trump to begin with, voting for Democrats, refusing to vote Republican tomorrow. I do wonder if that's what it looks like in the results tomorrow, if the analysis on that is going to point to the final week or 2 weeks of this campaign when Donald Trump chose to play up the caravan, not so much to emphasize the economy. I know there's a story of Paul Ryan apparently asking him to play up the economy more. Do you think there's a relationship there, or was it just all baked in from farther back?
I think a lot of it was baked in. That we saw these people all dislike Donald Trump enough to go over. We never saw a bump in the polls after inauguration for this sort of Rhino, the suburban moderate. And as early as April of last year, when we had the election in Georgia, that John Ossoff was able to go into a district that Mitt Romney had got over 60% of the vote and basically get all the Rhino Republicans to vote for him. So I think that what Trump understood that Paul Ryan didn't understand was that those people weren't coming back as long as Trump was in the White House, and that what he needed to do is focus on the Senate. So I think he focused on the wrong aspect of immigration. But I think focusing on immigration was a Senate play rather than a House play.
Well, yeah, so that's a good segue then to the question of the Senate. So, Margie, you're optimistic, you're bullish when it comes to the House, but on the Senate side, Democrats need that net gain of 2. On paper, that doesn't sound huge, but you're talking about having to win a Tennessee or a Texas or a North Dakota and a bunch of other things having to break your way. How do you feel? How do you look at the Senate right now?
Well, I mean, there are fewer races. You can kind of get your arms around them a little bit to look at each one individually. And for, and here's the difference, I think, with the Democratic incumbents in the Senate versus Republican incumbents in the House is that these Democratic senators in Trump states were not surprised this cycle to learn that their state had Republican tendencies. This is not something that just happened. That's not a new phenomenon. These are folks who ran for office, many of them have been running up for office in their state for years in that climate, so they're well versed in how to talk to the voters in their states. And I think you see in some places, like for example Heller in Nevada, feeling having a hard time presenting authenticity about how to talk about Trump, that I think can cause problems with voters who want to feel that they have a leader who is is true to their own beliefs and is speaking authentically. And you have Claire McCaskill, who has, I think, spoken very authentically about her own views for a long time. She's a strong candidate, while Hawley, her opponent, has not been authentic when he's talking about health care. So I think that puts some Republicans at a disadvantage. Again, the early voting and registration numbers suggest a surge in turnout in Tennessee. Is that the Taylor Swift effect? We don't know. There's some things that are still up in the air. But for sure, it has been more challenging in the Senate. That's exactly where we expected this Senate map to lead us when we first started the cycle right after the 2016 election.
Well, where do you think it'll land? If it's 51-49 Republicans right now, what's your sense right now, looking at 24 hours out? Where do you think it'll land?
I think it's going to land at 52-48. I think it could, though, land as close as 50-50. There's going to be 3 or 4 races that are really, really tight: Nevada, Arizona, Missouri, in Indiana and Florida, and just a little bit of change one way or the other, whether it's a Democratic turnout surge or it's some Republicans who really just come back to their party in the voting booth. But my best guess is 52-48.
52-48, and just break that down. What would that be? A gain in North Dakota for Republicans?
That would be a gain in North Dakota and a loss of Nevada and Arizona. That's where I'm at right now.
All right.
And a gain in Missouri and Indiana. So they pick up 3 and they lose 2 for a net 1.
Okay, Margie, let me ask you this way: between those 3, the way I look at it, I've been saying for Democrats is pick one. Texas, Tennessee, North Dakota. You got to win one of those to put this thing in play with other combinations. Which one of those 3 do you feel the most optimistic about and the least optimistic?
Look, I'm looking at the same stuff as everybody else. I think, look, here's the thing to remember when you look at the public polling, and what we see is ultimately just the head-to-head. And I know that that's how people vote, and I know you want me to give my final prediction. The numbers underneath the surface really can tell you how the race is shifting and how it's moving, and a little bit more about who's voting, who's enthusiastic about voting. You don't see that in some of these bigger state public polls or in the national polls. I think Texas is probably a state that's been really over-investigated and over-explored relative to other states. That's going to be interesting. Whatever the outcome, it's going to result in, I'm sure, a lot more investigation and what happened there. Tennessee, I think, is something that's important to watch. And North Dakota seems it's moved a little bit away from Democrats. But, on the other hand, you've had a lot of grassroots support for Senator Heitkamp after the Kavanaugh hearing.
Let me, I want to shift gears here and just, there are a few pieces of data out there that I'm looking at that are making me go, And I don't want to overplay this, but I want to ask you both about them because I think everybody is haunted a little bit by 2016, where I think there were a few things leading up to that election that made you have the same reaction. And yet the expectation was still, Hillary Clinton's ahead in the polls. Trump had some bad numbers on, is he qualified? Do you trust him with a nuclear code? Those sort of things. And yet we saw on Election Day that there was a surprise there. So here's what's making me go, right now. 2 things. Number one, this is from our NBC News Wall Street Journal poll yesterday. The president's approval rating. I just showed this a second ago. In our poll, we've got him sitting at 46% approval. Actually, an increase of a point from the last time we took the poll. This is basically the ceiling. This is like as good as it's been for Trump in our poll since he became president. Now, we're on the higher side of what's out there, but as I showed at the top of the show, his average approval rating is sitting a touch under 44%. And again, around Labor Day, that average was sitting closer to 40. So it does seem to have gone up a few points. The other one is, again, from our poll here, this question of enthusiasm. Do you have a really high level of interest in the election? And we find a very, 85% of likely Democratic voters, 82% of likely Republican voters. If you take that a step back and just go to registered voters, it's basically dead even. That's also a change from something we were finding earlier this year. Earlier this year, we were finding Democrats double digits ahead right there. So I'm going to just put the same question to both of you, and I guess I'll start with you, Henry Olsen. The approval rating and the enthusiasm numbers look better for Republicans now than they did at Labor Day. Do you see in that any kind of makings of a surprise like we had in 2016?
Yeah, that's the biggest thing that I think is the known unknown, is that even the approval rating is up. And when you look at 44, 45, 46 nationwide, in those Senate races, that means that Trump is at 50 or above because of the Republican nature of those seats. And there's a poll that just came out yesterday in Missouri that had Hawley down at 47% and losing, but had Trump's approval at 51%. So that means that there's people who like Donald Trump, approve the job he's doing, who, according to the poll right now, aren't voting for a Republican. If they change their mind on Election Day, that's where we'll see the Republican surprise coming through of Trump supporters coming home to their party.
And just if that were to happen, so in the Senate side, you're giving some clear examples. Would that change your sense of the House at all?
Absolutely. Is that if that were to happen, I think Martha McSally were to win. I would think that Montana would then be a close race because all the polls that I've seen in Montana, all 2 of them, have Rosendale, the Republican nominee, losing over 20% of people who support Donald Trump. You cut that in half so that he's losing only 10% of the Trump supporter, Trump job approval people, and it's a neck-and-neck race with Tester. So if that does happen, then I think Missouri's an easy pickup, Indiana's an easy pickup, McSally wins in Arizona, so we're already at +3 for the Republicans, and Montana becomes the too close to call race.
And Margie, I'll just throw it over to you. The the approval rating and the enthusiasm question. Do you make of it any cautionary note there for Democrats?
Yeah, they're absolutely watch-outs. They are absolutely watch-outs that have fluctuated, and with Republicans closing a bit as we get into the home stretch. I think it's important to look at those numbers compared to 14 and 10, where Democrats were really much lower in terms of enthusiasm compared to Republicans, even when you're comparing the same polling outlets over time. So I still think that there's an advantage over previous midterms for Democrats. That the gap is different. And the president's approval rating can fluctuate. It's higher now than it was, say, during Charlottesville. Still, we're talking about a narrow band of historically low approval ratings for a sitting president. I mean, and let's not forget the intensity of that disapproval. That disapproval is real strong disapproval. He doesn't have a lot of squishy, like, oh, I'm not sure. I'm just sort of waiting and seeing what the president does. I mean, people have really decided very clearly how they feel about him. And he still more disapprove of him than approve of him, and that is very much telling. So you're right; those numbers have fluctuated in a way that we should be concerned about. And I think ultimately the question is not whether or not there's a red wave or a blue wave. I know some folks have been talking about a red wave. It's really, how many seats are we talking about? And is it enough? Will we come up short, which is a different kind of calculation than blue wave versus red wave. Right.
I feel at this point, if the Democratic gains were to be limited to like 19 seats, Republicans would call that a red wave because it would mean keeping control of the House. But
it's not really. I mean, sure, they can say that, but that's not really,
right.
A red wave.
Let me.
The president's calling it that, but it's not that. Yeah.
Let me just close on this question to both of you, and I'm going to take one option off the board, but just from talking to people who are going to be watching this tomorrow night as viewers and trying to get a sense early on what to be looking for in early race, relatively early in the night that you're looking at that could give people a good sense. I'm going to take Kentucky's 6th district off the board. It's literally the first one that's going to start reporting at 6 o'clock. It's a Trump district where Democrats think they have a chance with Amy McGrath, so I'll kind of make that my choice. But I'm curious, in those early closings, 6, 7, 8 o'clock, what are you looking at that's likely to be evident pretty soon? Henry, I'll start with you.
Indiana Senate, that also closes at 6 o'clock, and we'll get the returns pretty quickly. If Joe Donnelly's cruising to a 2, 3, 4-point win, that's going to be an indication of a very good night for Democrats. If Mike Braun comes from behind and is winning by 2 or 3 points, that suggests maybe that the Republicans will limit their losses. I agree with Margie. There ain't going to be no red wave, but the question is it a blue wave or is it kind of like a blue tide?
And Margie, how about you? What's an early one to keep an eye on?
So I would look at the race where I did door knocking yesterday, and that is Virginia 7, Abigail Spanberger, who's challenging Congressman Dave Bratt. That is, on the East Coast, and the polls close at 7 o'clock. And that's a race that would not be necessarily competitive just on the district alone. It's one where you have a really strong Democratic candidate, a Republican candidate who has not had a tough battle before, a district that could be competitive, but wouldn't be the first. It's not like Virginia 10, Barbara Comstock, which is, kind of would always be on a toss-up list. So it's on that outer ring of battleground districts, but you have a strong Democratic candidate. And the Republican candidate early on in the cycle said, why are women getting up in my grill? And that sort of focused kind of the story of the power of women voting and their activism this cycle. That was one of the early examples of that was in this race. So we'll see if that leads to, will he get reelected or will he have a strong Democratic woman unseat him?
Yeah, that Virginia 7th is fascinating, too. Just the sort of potential bookends there of Dave Bratt taking out Eric Cantor in 2014 and that sort of being a harbinger maybe of the grassroots mood that gave rise to Trump. And then the Trump midterm, maybe, if it turns out the way you're hoping, Margie, maybe that would be the end for Dave Bratt 4 years later. That'd be a very interesting storyline there. Margie Omero and Henry Olsen, thank you both. This is exactly the kinds of guests I like to have the day before the election. A little look at what you guys are seeing there. Again, less than 24 hours now to the first poll closing. Thank you both for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thanks a lot.
And thank you for watching at home. This has been fun the last few weeks. Every day we've been breaking it down. And I said, midnight tonight, Northern New Hampshire. couple dozen, less than a couple dozen votes, maybe a dozen votes, I think, are going to come in, and Election Day will officially be underway, and it's going to get a lot more interesting from there. So we will be here all day tomorrow, all night tomorrow. I'll be at that board starting at 6 o'clock when Indiana and Kentucky start reporting in, and I've told them as long as it takes to find out what's happening, please don't kick me away from the board there. I want to be there. So thank you for joining us. We will see you on Election Night. I'm Steve Kornacki. Bye-bye.